want to talk to you about value judgments. I know that this is pretty esoteric. I can look back now in the early 1970s and say value judgments was just an inkling back then. The families I work with could see how value judgments eventually led to where we are now. That inkling back then stimulated the idea and the words of the concept. The idea that when you're pregnant, it's beneficial and normal and natural to learn some skills. That's the idea in the words. For all births. So we said that because the messages being given in the United States back then was that, one is you should take a childbirth classes, which we all did in the millions, but those classes were really targeting to low-risk women to achieve a natural birth, pain-free labor without medical care. For the families I worked with, that message seemed unsettling at the time because it was only for low-risk women with narrow goals. So the seed of the concept was that 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth. There are really no goals, that we should just be skilled to birth our baby because it's an activity that's infrequent, life-transforming, and it's something that we can do with skills. And Lamaze and Bradley were showing that. And as I said in other videos, those two systems that were focused on low-risk women achieving natural birth, pain-free labor that wasn't being achieved. The goal that was really being achieved was the reduction of suffering. People just birth better when they're skilled, even if they barely use any skill. Any skill is better than no skill. However, back then in the 70s, and certainly in the 80s, the natural birth advocates, the home birth midwifery advocates, famous people saying that skills aren't achieving those goals, but choices are. There's too much medical interventions. Not everyone has this amazing opportunity to live through time frames such as I have, where there have been different viewpoints around something so significant as childbirth. This whole course is explaining how we got here because of what happened in my lifetime and how families I worked with were responding back then to what was happening around them. What was happening around us back then in the 70s and the 80s has led us to today. And when we're looking at concepts, ideas, words, actions, systems, policies, how are we doing? And the reason that I'm creating this course today is all of us know we are not doing well. And if we look at not doing well, why is that? Now let's take a look at value judgment. We know that we each have our own values and we make judgments. And a lot of these conversations that we consider to be political are actually cultural or societal. In 1970, when I gave birth, I can honestly tell you that I couldn't have identified my value around childbirth, and I couldn't have identified any other woman's values around childbirth. I worked with very, very religious families. Many of them were never, ever going to use modern medicine, ever under any circumstances, like Christian Scientists. Yet many very religious families use every form of modern medicine they possibly could. I also worked with very alternative people and who were called hippies back then, who were into natural wellness. Everybody has their own values. Back in the 1970s, we could have values, but we lacked choices in maternity system. And that's what feels political, doesn't it? So that self-value judgment actually morphed into the next trend of the 1980s that we're in today. Choices in birth plans. In other words, my values, what I wanted at birth, I write down in a birth plan. Those are my choices. Those are my values. And because I am in countries like the United States paying someone, you expect them to give you that. Within New Zealand, midwives say to their clients in a system where healthcare is free, my value as a midwife is to give you the birth that you want. So when I gave birth in the 70s, I don't know any woman who judged anyone else's birth or how we raised our kids or whether we bottle fed or breastfed or whether we disciplined or didn't or what. There just wasn't that conversation. And I gave birth last in 1982, and that had entirely changed. By the 80s, there was an incredible amount of, this is my values, I can make a birth plan, this is my judgment, I want to have this kind of a birth. But what also developed, or what we now know, is the mummy wars. breastfeeding versus bottle feeding, natural versus medical, home versus hospital, midwife versus doctor, stay at home, work, carry the baby, put it down, schedule feed, on demand, let it cry, don't let it cry, train to sleep at night, get up in the middle of the night, homeschool, public school, vaccinate, don't vaccinate, antibiotics, don't. We know what the mummy wars are. They're recent in our life, and they never came from politics. They came from value judgments or judging other people's values. This is cultural and societal. For us, as Common Knowledge Trust and all of the families I worked with, we moved past this or above it or around it. 100% of pregnant women are going to give birth one way or another around the world, within diverse cultures and societies, and within diverse governmental systems, or what is called politics. I know because in 1970, chiropractors were not accepted by the medical profession. I also know, having lived in New Zealand that has a Commonwealth healthcare system rather than a Medical Practice Act, that it has been much harder for chiropractors to interface within that Medical Practice Act. For chiropractors to be well accepted, the Webster technique to be well accepted, you did not change the government. You changed attitudes. You changed opinions. Those opinions were in the form of ideas, words, and actions. When ICPA formed, you put it into a system. And within ICPA, you have policies. Those policies interface with each country where ICPA members exist and each state where they exist. So what is helpful in understanding how to change the attitude of your clients is to come out of politics and to come into value judgments where people have values, have their own judgments, where you don't judge their values, and those are linked to culture and society. And what we're saying in the concept is that societies and cultures benefit from having a self-learning, skilled birthing population because pregnancy and birth are universal. And in the early 70s, knowing this inkling of this, freed us to develop the concept and the Birthing Better skills for all births. Because in the reality of families that I worked with, and this is true for the families you work with, there really is no natural or medical birth. There's only each individual's activity that each woman is doing within her society and culture and within the systems that are available to her. Worldwide, in the developed countries, the present childbirth trend is choice. I choose this. We can call it a value, but we're also, in many ways, it was a political statement. And we hear that today. I'm anti-medical. That's not just a value. That is really judging the politics. For us as Common Knowledge Trust, we step outside of that. We knew in the early 60s and 70s that we had the potential in the skills-based childbirth trend to see the reality of birth, which is that it's universal. But when it got dragged into the politics, low risk versus high risk, then we started to imply a judgment of values where we accepted some and rejected others. And this, for our viewpoint in Common Knowledge Trust, creates unnecessary factions and frictions within culture and society. Because in reality, I'm talking to you. You've had a birth or not. Have you ever walked up to a stranger in a supermarket or in your church or on the street and said to them, "What kind of birth have you had?" Have you really ever walked up to a total stranger, man or woman, and said, "Did you let your baby cry or did you pick it up every time it cried?" We don't even have a conversation about this. So our trust holds the values of all families becoming skilled through self-learning and using skills to work through the activity of birthing their baby. Given that we have value judgment and then we have judging values, we are asking ICPA members to adopt a value that we believe makes common sense. You are not responsible for how each client responds to the concept. We are just asking you to be responsible to getting the concept out to as many people as possible. because we believe, and have for 50 years, that when we grow a self-learning, skilled birthing population for all births, no matter the circumstances, that we will have a positive impact on individual women, individual families, and that this will have an impact on our societies. If there are 8,000 ICPA members and you're only working with 10 women a year, that's 80,000 women. Each of them has their own value. They have their own value judgment. You know the mummy wars are still active, and you know that women are judging other women's values. So can you step outside of the judging of values and just give that concept and handout? And inspiring enough families to start saying and doing the same thing that changes cultural and societal messages. Because a self-learning, skilled birthing population can exist in any healthcare system that is set into policies through the governmental or political systems of the day. And that means something.